Hello, in this video, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about how our fear response develops. Then we'll go on and we'll talk about the 3 stages of the General Adaptation Syndrome. You'll then go on and watch videos that specifically talk about the sympathetic nervous system response, something that we've covered before, and then another video covering the HPA axis. By the end of watching all 3 of these videos, you should have a really good understanding of what happens in response to a brief stressor and a long-term stressor. All right, so if you haven't already done so, please go ahead and take the Holmes and Rahe Life Stress Inventory. You can find it in the Canvas modules. And then after you take that, you'll get a score. Please make sure you record that. It'll tell you what the score means. Then I'd like you to go and take a Google poll. And then at the very end of this chapter module, after you've watched all the videos, done a few other assignments, there's a kind of reflection assignment where you're going to need to know your stress inventory number, and you're going to go back and look at the poll results for the entire class. And I have a few reflection questions. So it's an important thing to do, and I'd like you to do that before watching the rest of these videos on stress and health. So now let's talk about how emotions develop. In particular, we're going to talk about fear and anxiety. So babies aren't born afraid. The fear response doesn't really develop in them until about 1 to 2 years of age. And if you think about why would that be? Why would you want a baby to be afraid when they can't get away? Remember, that's part of that fight or flight response we have. We come across something that we're afraid of, and we can either stay and fight or flee. A newborn baby can't do that. So that fear response develops over time. Instead, they're born with a reflex called the moral reflex. And this helps them have automatic responses to stimuli that could be or should be something that they are afraid of. So what's going on with this moral reflex is that the infants hear a loud sound and they splay their arms out, extending their limbs, have an arched back, and sometimes they even cry. And so it's sometimes known as the startle reflex. And so again, it's this innate thing that infants are born with that is kind of their natural fear mechanism until it develops over time. And what's happening in the brain is that auditory information stimulates an area of the pons that commands the tensing of the neck and other muscles. This information reaches the pons in 3 to 8 milliseconds, and the startle response often occurs within 0.2 of a second after that. Now, after infancy, what happens when we hear a loud sound? That moral reflex disappears in that first 4 to 6 months. There's a whole bunch of other newborn reflexes that are also there present at birth that disappear in that first year of life. So after this moral reflex occurs, what happens when we hear a loud sound? What's your bodily reactions? What's one of the things that you feel? Our neck muscles also tense up. So again, even as adults, we hear a loud sound. Those pons tense the muscles in our neck. This is again happening very quickly within 3 to 8 milliseconds. And then the amygdala is going to enhance that startle response. Remember, we talked about the amygdala being part of that emotional response, part of the fear response. And yes, there is some research that suggests it's a little more complicated than that. But proneness to approach, avoidance, anxiety, all varies with the situation and the individual. But this is just kind of one of those innate natural mechanisms that we have. So I know you took the Holmes and Rahe Life Stress Inventory, but I wanted to point out some other things that are also common sources of stress. So here, most common sources of stress, and of course this might have changed in light of some recent events, but back in 2017, the future of our nation, money, work, political climate, violence and crime, those were the top 5 most common sources of stress. The top causes of stress in the U.S., job pressure, money, health, relationships, poor nutrition, media overload, sleep deprivation, all things that we've been facing. We face all the time, but of course in recent events, maybe even more so. So what is stress? What do you think of when you think of stress? I mean, of course, you probably think of some of those things that were mentioned in the Holmes and Rahe Stress Inventory. Probably think of some of those things that were on the previous slide. But what would we call? Those are all external events. They're doing what to our body? They're putting a demand on our body, and stress is our body's response to those demands. So one way of thinking about stress is that it's a response of the body to some sort of demand, or a reaction to a stimulus that causes physical, mental, or emotional tension. Now, here's a question for you. Is stress always negative? No. At first, it's going to increase our productivity. So when you're stressed at first, it's going to increase your productivity. You're going to be able to do more than you would under normal circumstances. But if that stress extends for a long period of time, and we have prolonged stress, there are a lot of negative effects. So now we're going to talk about the General Adaptation Syndrome. So Hans Selye, who many acknowledge as the father of stress, was a medical researcher, and he was studying sex hormones when he noticed that the animal that he was doing research on often had very similar patterns of physical response to adverse physical conditions. He observed this in response to several different adverse events, restraint, blaring lights, predators, that caused lab animals to respond with very similar physical reactions, such as increased heart rate, rapid breathing, enlargement of adrenal glands, ulcers, all things that we kind of consider when we think about stress. He also noticed that patients that had a variety of different diseases shared similar symptoms, such as fever, loss of appetite, inactivity, immune systems were more active. And so he took all that together and developed what we called the General Adaptation Syndrome. So the first stage of this General Adaptation Syndrome is the alarm stage. And this is going to be the sympathetic nervous system that's prepping that body for, do you remember what we called it? Kind of response, that fight or flight response. And do you remember what neurotransmitter was involved? Think SNAP. Sympathetic, SN, norepinephrine. And so we are going to see increased sympathetic nervous system activity with norepinephrine being released. Now you're going to watch a second video that details what's going on in the sympathetic nervous system, and it's going to mention epinephrine being released from the adrenal glands. So just so you know that I'm going to hold you responsible for knowing that norepinephrine is released from those sympathetic system nerves, and then epinephrine is also released during this alarm stage from those adrenal glands. The second stage is the resistance stage, and this is when the sympathetic nervous system response starts to decline, and then the adrenal cortex takes over and starts to release cortisol and other hormones in response to this prolonged type of stressor. This cortisol is going to prolong our alertness, allowing the body to fight infections, heal wounds, and again just maintain that heightened arousal during this prolonged stressor. And then after long periods of time, the exhaustion stage occurs. So this is after a prolonged stress, and our body's just kind of tired. We're vulnerable. We're inactive. We have, decreased energy because basically we've worn our immune system out. We've used up all of our cortisol and all these different things. All these bad things are happening in our body. So these are the three stages of the General Adaptation Syndrome: the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage. Now you're going to watch two videos that go in detail a little bit more in depth about how the sympathetic nervous system responds during the alarm stage, and then during the resistance stage, what systems are at play here.